Good morning, everybody. Hope you all are doing well today. I just want to make a quick reminder to just keep your eye out on your discussion board questions. We're running into the latter ends of this semester, so I want to make sure that you're still doing them. I think we've got three more potential ones to go, and again, I grade 7 and drop the lowest one. I will mention real quick on your grade book to remember that the averages may not necessarily reflect what's on there. So, because the discussion board questions typically are going to be based in participation rather than just points itself. I'm just establishing that you have done them, and again, that you have put thought into them. And some people have really put in the effort to not only post but reply. I really encourage you to do that. Um, Again, most people have participated, but there are some that, again, will get full credit just because they continue to be able to post on other people's as well. And so I really encourage you to do that. That's a major consideration in terms of doing the best you can there. I also graded your first case study. I think overall they were well done. I do think there were some things that stood out in terms of the people who did exceptional versus did well. And I think largely that had to do with how you researched. And for instance, some of you went on to the actual code of conduct for the two organizations in question. Um, I certainly enjoyed some of your alternate opinions, as some people took some different approaches than I was expecting. I also wanted to mention that while I do appreciate some of the style guides that are used, I do prefer that you use APA or Chicago for any of your papers. I didn't take off for that, but it is something that most journals that use any kind of style guides when it comes to communication specifically typically use APA or Chicago. So please keep that in mind. There were a handful of stylized errors that came along with it, as well as some areas where a lot of people didn't use some of the areas like expanding on Kantian ethics or utilitarianism or the Hunt Vittel. Hunt Vittel was one that was not used quite often when a lot of people were talking about social norms but didn't include Hunt Vittel. So please make sure to remember those because, again, anything you write needs to be backed up especially when you're trying to make claims and so forth. So again, just something to take into consideration. If you have any questions, please let me know. Again, I think they went well, but I just think there are some areas that can be have room for improvement in this case. So for today, we're getting on the slate of once again talking about controversial products, and this one is a little close to home, especially since I like craft beer, for instance, and it's part of a kind of a cultural thing in terms of being able to imbibe and enjoy craft beer as the flavor of how the particular beer tastes is something that, for instance, my wife and I like to enjoy. So, we like to go to Appalachian Mountain Brewery, Boonshine, Blowing Rock Brewery, Flat Top, that kind of thing here in this area. But there is the notion of alcohol advertising that runs into this issue of, again, advertising and kind of the framing messages. And this is going to be, in one of my personal opinions so far, we've talked a lot about a lot of things that most of y'all have a pretty consensus answer for, especially when we're talking about like marginalized groups. There are clear answers that advertisers have clearly been doing something wrong. And the same with a lot of you had some very strong opinions for vaping and smoking and tobacco in general. Alcohol is a little bit different in this case for a lot of people because this is one of the first times we're looking at something that is going into our system that's not necessarily affecting others. Now, drunken frivolity can obviously affect others in your life. Alcoholism can certainly affect other people in your life. But at the same time, having a beer is one of those areas where, it's not going to be something that many people are going to be really upset about for the most part. There will obviously, especially when we talk about like religious practices, there are going to be religions that say, this is something that I'm strongly against. And that may be an area where alcohol advertising is really frowned upon. But we see it everywhere, and they are not nearly as heavily restricted as something like tobacco. And that's a pretty interesting thing because, again, this kind of falls into this high risk product where it kind of lowers inhibition, that kind of thing. And it is the area within alcohol advertising that they're one of the rare at-risk products that self-regulate. So again, this goes back to if you ever see an alcohol advertisement that says, please drink responsibly, that's something that they self-regulate. In addition to that, you will rarely, if ever, see anybody actually take a drink of the alcohol. It will just be in the place of the advertisement itself. Typically, I don't know if this is true anymore. It used to be that you couldn't actually drink actual alcohol or show actual alcohol on the promotion in the advertisement. So let's look at a couple things here. First and foremost, our arguments are restricting alcohol advertisement, and you can see there is quite a bit of it. And so young people are vulnerable to alcohol advertising, as we'll mention throughout the course of this lecture today, of ritual of passage being rebellious and the mark of being sexy in this case. This is where we talk about the alcohol marketing targeting to use under 21. And it's interesting, I think this was back when I was in college, or in grad school specifically, so around 2007, 2009, Bud Light, the Anheuser-Busch released cans of Bud Light that were in the colors of certain universities. Now, they, if memory serves correctly, they still do NFL teams, for instance, but they used to do college team colors. In fact, I remember going to a grocery store before a tailgate at a Virginia Tech game and seeing a can that was orange and maroon, which was obviously a very prominent can that was featured amongst those who were imbibing before a Virginia Tech game. Now, were all those people 21? I highly doubt it. In fact, I knew because some of them were my students, and I knew that they were not 21. So, again, this is an area where this is targeted. And again, college is probably one of the most strong primary demographics that are promoted into alcohol advertising in general, because you're free. You are free to, you are not near I don't think you're probably less near your parents in this case. You have a lot more autonomy, and this is the opportunity to, utilize that autonomy. And some people choose that for rebellion. Some people choose it to say, I don't have to be home at any point in time, so, I'm going to enjoy myself. Alcohol advertising also encourages binge drinking, which is harmful to health and serious issue on college campuses. This was actually a product for almost a PR campaign for the National Student Advertising Competition that had to deal with binge drinking, which was kind of cool because, normally we get products, but this is the first one that they did something different. So some campaigns were something along the line of the stupid drink, which I wasn't a huge fan of the actual big idea, but I liked their slogan, which was, let's see, how did it go? It was something along the lines of, you thought you could sing, and you could 3 drinks ago. Or you thought you were smooth with flirting, and you were 2 drinks ago. That kind of thing. And I thought that was a clever idea in this case. In fact, the ones that were illustrated back in my alma mater at North Dakota State were actually fairly popular. I think it was called Before One More, if memory serves, and they still have T-shirts that are delivered on campus that I see people working out with all the time. And again, it is a relatively successful campaign, I think. And it may be one of those that increases awareness, but may not actually do a whole lot of work in terms of the job that it's doing. And I say that almost like for milk, for instance. So you probably remember the commercials that were like Got Milk. It's one of the weirdest conundrums within advertising because it was one of those that increased milk's awareness fourfold. I mean, it was so well done in this case. However, it didn't raise any purchasing of milk products. So again, this was a major consideration to where did it actually work? And so this is where Before One More certainly has a lot of awareness, but has it actually stopped people? And we'll talk about that here in a bit. Alcohol advertisers ban, this was a while ago, led to less alcohol consumption, and this was a big help there. Current restrictions are not effective. Time restriction may increase as alcohol advertising exposed among adolescents as well. And you can see, again, some of the statistics that kind of run into these on some of these infographics. And these are major considerations. This is why, again, within the college campus, that this is something that's talked about quite frequently, why there's a lot of organizations that are placed into there. And again, this does address a lot of serious issues, whether or not you think alcohol is inherently bad or not. It is something where there are, this is like where I've always talked about, certain things act as tools, and, you can have a drink and, nothing bad would come of it. But there are instances where if you drink too much, that can be a very risky, can lead to a lot of at-risk problems here. Again, it's restricting advertising. First and foremost, they're not targeting to teenagers under 21, and there's a lot of research that looks into that. Alcohol advertising has weaker influence on adolescent drinking than peer influence and parental influence, and that some has no effect on young people. And again, remember that there's that big difference between awareness versus actual consumption, because you look at a lot of advertisements that are within the Super Bowl, those Clydesdale commercials that come with Budweiser that, rip your heartstrings out, or even Budweiser that does a lot of funny ads and that were extremely memorable. Does that actually lead to more alcohol sales is a whole nother question. So they may remember some of the catchy things that go along with it, but again, actually buying it may be a different story. Alcohol bans did not lead to less alcohol consumption, and that's, I would imagine, pretty predictable. And the current restrictions on alcohol are effective. They tried to ban the sale of alcohol. This is prohibition, but that failed. And a lot of this came about to people are going to do what they're going to do. So, again, now, the fact that they saw this as a negative still didn't stop people from consuming alcohol in this case. So within some of the examples within alcohol advertising, though, talking about cartoonish or legacy characters, you can see this with Captain Morgan, for instance. This has gone quite long in terms of the mascots that reveal. And they actually, in some of their print ads, they use sex appeal as well. Within Captain Morgan as well. And again, this is a notion of the same premise that would happen a lot with the area within tobacco regulations and tobacco advertising. And again, is it right for alcohol advertising to use these mascots, whereas, again, tobacco is was highly criticized for Joe Camel. And what I didn't put up here is the kind of classic Budweiser frogs, for instance, and that can be something within these characters to attract young people. Again, but this does go back to, excuse me, this goes back to the whole notion of awareness versus purchasing. Again, I know I'm saying that a lot, excuse me. We talk about individualism, for instance, in this area of rebellion, because again, part of what is occurring here is one of the major ethical considerations is that many people within the United States consider alcohol the forbidden fruit because of the age restriction. And again, we're one of the only countries that has our drinking age at 21. Majority of countries have some variation of around 18 to 19 years old. Some European countries, say 16 with a meal, for instance. So, like if you go to the United Kingdom and you're 16, you can have a beverage with a meal. Or you might have to have an adult present while this is occurring. But again, typically the age is 18 in this case. So this really comes into play, again, within college students, within that liberty or freedom that you have independence from everybody else, and you can kind of live the way that you want to specifically because you're not at home in this case. Also, sex appeal comes up quite a bit in this case. And, this is also something to be considered with the notion of tobacco. And again, using what is kind of considered high sensation seeking. When we're talking about like copy or imagery and stuff like that. And this is a notion where we say, is this ethical to promote alcohol with regards to sex? I mean, there was a big fiasco with Anheuser-Busch for the kind of Up for Anything campaign, and the way they framed some of their copies suggested the prospect within date rape, for instance, and that was obviously met with a lot of scrutiny in terms of the way that was promoted, because this happens quite a lot, unfortunately, when alcohol is in the mix. So, these are some of the areas where ethical issues, how do we frame some of these messages, and is it ethical to promote something with, again, characters or independence or sex, for instance, or, as we see here, in terms of masculinity appeal for young male audiences. The most interesting man in the world that has changed a little bit, but at the same time still promotes it almost in the way that Axe would promote some of their commercials. And when I say that, you have the person that is courting a young woman who is considered attractive. This, I have to admit, I do like the Bud Light ads with the drinking rules in this case. But again, this goes back to hypermasculinity in this case, of what makes a male in this case. And these are areas of concern as well. This also has a lot to do with movie tie-ins. I mean, James Bond, the shaken not stirred martini has always been something been promoted. And even with Daniel Craig in this case, Heineken has gotten in on a little bit of the market when it comes to using James Bond. Mad Men as well are an interesting component. And again, this may appear not necessarily in a commercial, but it also may appear within the consideration of product placement as well. Now, some shows like New Girl, for instance, have a specific beer to make it so that it doesn't look like actual product placement. However, if paid, this is an area where advertisers can use this within product placement of using the actual beer. alcohol advertising when it comes to utilizing new media, social media. And so some of you in this class might recognize this front ad here. And again, this is the ethical consideration. When we did this, so we did this project in a social media strategies class, to where we did Barks and Brews, which was probably one of the easiest ways to market to somebody in Boone. And I say that because we're talking about people who like pets, which people love pets around the Boone area, and people who like beer, which people love beer around the Boone area. And combining these together was something that we would have to talk about in terms of the ethical considerations of what we're doing here. And we did not want anybody to get intoxicated. This is an area within craft beer, for instance, that has been talked about quite a lot. And I can speak to that because I've done a lot of research in terms of interviewing brewers at craft breweries, small batch breweries. And one of the things that had been talked about was this whole notion of how we can use craft beer to enjoy ourselves, to engage into a social identity, engage in collaboration and help among the community. And because many of these craft beer organizations and these breweries typically are very involved with the community that they serve. So A&B, for instance, is a great example of that, because they partner with so many different organizations to help raise awareness or raise funds for so many people. And again, but this is the consideration where we would talk about this within our class, to say, how do we make it so that it doesn't seem like it's binge drinking? And many brewers that I've talked to said, it does go back to in moderation. We don't consider craft beer in this case to be the thing that you go out and drink till 3 o'clock in the morning and binge drink. This is something where we want people to enjoy what's being served to them, almost kind of as a wine culture, or what's perceivably the wine culture. And if you know anything about wine culture, a lot of the expectations is to consume the wine by putting the small bit into your mouth and then actually spitting it out, so that you get the flavor but not the intoxication. And so, although I've never seen anybody spit out their beer, it is something within alcohol advertising that needs to be taken into consideration. Because again, what is the culture around that? And many craft brewers have made a tremendous effort to say, we are not associated with binge drinking, or we don't want to be associated with. I don't think anybody does, but again, it is about the enjoyment here. So, and a lot of these, I'd sit there and go, Barks and Brews, I would go to even if I wasn't teaching the class. Boone Rail Jam, I would go to that as well. I think that's a really cool event. But we've always talked about, is that the kind of thing that is considered ethical in this case? Alcohol advertising with regards to sports. We just got done with the World Cup, and alcohol plays a colossal role in sport. And we see this within some of the biggest sporting events. So we see this within college football and the national championship, the Super Bowl, the event that generates more advertising revenue than anybody, which is March Madness. Again, the World Cup, the Olympics, for instance. And these are really interesting case studies because Budweiser, for instance, within the World Cup, kind of runs the table with alcohol distribution in terms of what can be served. Now, that has changed a little bit since Anheuser-Busch has bought out some smaller batch breweries, mainly for distribution purposes, but at the same time, this is the area where you would sit there and say, not only is it how they advertise during the games and so forth, but also how it's marked up and worked on when the event actually occurs, because they have such a stranglehold on the market itself. And so, again, is this something that is considered unethical when it comes to sports, especially with college sports? Because, again, March Madness, I am saying again so much right now. March Madness is one of those events that generates a lot of revenue. It goes on for a long period of time. And alcohol is advertised during that. And we have to consider if that is something that, given the nature, now you may not agree with the drinking age. I think there's a lot of people that don't agree with the drinking age, but the fact is that is the law. And within that law, what is the ethical consideration that holds true in this case? So I think this is an interesting case study, and I think it is one of the areas where we're talking about an ethical issue with the premise of saying, is this okay? Is this okay to advertise something that largely has a very strong either area of people defending it or people against it and so forth? So that's it for today. I hope you'll have a wonderful day. The weather's kind of outside, but I will be recording tomorrow and we'll go from there. So I hope you'll have a wonderful day, and I will see you all tomorrow.